Hello, and welcome to our weekly live dialogue with Helga Zepp-LaRouche. She is the founder and chairwoman of the Schiller Institute. It's August 23rd, 2023. I'm Harley Schlanger, and I will be your host today. If you have questions or comments you'd like to send to us, you can send them at questions@schillerinstitute.org, or you can post them in the chat room and they'll be forwarded to me. Well, today is the second day of the historic BRICS Summit taking place in Johannesburg, South Africa. It's been greeted with excitement from most of the world, and I should say dismay from the City of London and its adherents. Helga, you drafted a statement, an appeal to the citizens of the global North. We must support the construction of a new just world economic order, which viewers can read and sign and circulate, as we want to get this discussion going in the global North. Now, many people complain that there's no one in the governments in the global North who will listen to this or who will pay attention. So what effect did you intend in drafting this statement?
Well, what a day. Let me first express my absolute joy about what happened today. I watched the BRICS Summit, the speeches. I heard the news and read the news about the very success of the Indian Chandrayaan-3 mission to the moon, which was highly successful. And then President Modi, Prime Minister Modi, announced in his speech that India will not only propose cooperation in space among the BRICS countries and the BRICS Plus countries soon, but that he will create or proposes to create a BRICS Space Cooperation Consortium. And, this is really, together with all the other many constructive proposals which were coming from the different heads of state, this marks a new beginning of a new age of mankind, because if the majority of countries start to cooperate in the exploration of space science, space travel, this will completely change the identity of man. We will definitely make the jump which started with the lifting of the first man off the earth, then the Apollo landing, and then basically now we have a definite idea of the major nations to cooperate in moving men into not only the moon, creating moon villages, going further, with the exploration of the possibility of eventually building a city on Mars and going beyond. And I can only say that there is no better proof about the excellent intention of the BRICS countries to move humanity into a new paradigm, a completely new way of living together than that decision. So I think it's an excellent day for humanity, and I want to use this and many other occasions to express my full-hearted congratulations to India for its successful moon mission, to the BRICS countries for their very successful BRICS Summit. And there were many other excellent points made. But I think altogether, if one listened to President Ramaphosa, President Lula, President Modi, President Putin, who was transmitting by live video, and Xi Jinping, then I can only say this was a breath of fresh air. If you compare, and if you don't believe me, please go to the YouTube or whatever other media and look at the speeches yourself, and you will get a completely different sense about the attitude and the outlook of these leaders than you are used from our politicians who, like, I don't even want to quote now any examples, not to bring the whole level down again to the daily level we are used to. I mean, this is the future, and this makes, to answer your question, this is making our campaign, which I initiated with an appeal to the citizens of the global North, that we must convince the countries of the global North to join this joyful transformation of the history of mankind, because if the North at this point is catching up with the optimism, with the cultural optimism which is expressed by the BRICS leaders, it can only be to the benefit of everybody. And I think it's the absolute important moment to stop this geopolitical arrogance, thinking that only the G7 are the good ones and all the other ones are barbarians living in a jungle, which Joseph Borrell had said at one point. He didn't say barbarians, but he said jungle. So I think this is an incredibly important moment, and I have written this appeal to the citizens of the global North to absolutely demand that the governments of the global North join this development and create a new world economic order for the benefit of all of mankind together. That is the demand of the hour, and we must absolutely not let this moment pass, because it is one of these absolute, spring or star moments of human history where you can really change the whole directionality where things go. Now, there has been a lot of concern, that will the Western leaders even listen to this? I think they will have to listen. I tried to find out what the main media were saying this morning, and there was hardly any coverage. And if it was, there are tensions between India and China, and they will never get their act together. Well, I think that this summit is proving the opposite, and this is so powerful that I think that, the Western leaders cannot ignore it, because, you have to always consider that the vast majority of the people in the developing South, which is now the global majority, are also watching this. And they are quite perfectly capable of comparing, what they're getting from the so-called West and what they are being offered by the BRICS. And I think the answer is very clear. So the only reasonable answer is don't condemn it, don't try to derail it, join it, because that is the way of the future.
And you can get Helga's statement on the schillerinstitute.com website, read it, circulate it. We're getting signatures coming in, and this is a very hopeful development. I would just tell you, Helga, that I before we started, I noticed on CNN and the Washington Post, their coverage of the Indian moon landing was essentially to contrast the success of India's mission with what they described as the failure of the Russian mission last week. And again, they're trying to do this divide and conquer, as opposed to acknowledge the great accomplishment of Indian scientists and engineers. Now, much of the opening day of the BRICS Summit was taken up with discussion of the role of the new development bank, the establishment of a mechanism of credit for a variety of trade agreements and so on. And so we received several questions that are related to the new development bank. They requested your thoughts on whether there will be a new financial system. Is this a step in the right direction? And also a very interesting comment. Someone asked, would Lyndon LaRouche urge the BRICS countries to not be cautious and move more aggressively toward a new system? So those are two questions for you.
Well, the answer to the first question is definitely yes. I think there is nothing in the world which will stop this except World War III, which would not be to the benefit of even those who started, because this is now, gaining a momentum. I mean, as I wrote in my appeal, the de-dollarization is not an aggressive act coming from the countries who are doing it. It's an act of self-defense. Because the sanctions, which were for the most part unilateral sanctions, not approved by the UN Security Council and therefore technically illegal, and on top of it, the weaponization of the dollar, whereby the US confiscated $300 billion or more from Russia, $9 billion from Afghanistan, also amounts from other countries. that has led to a situation where these countries basically said it's no longer secure to have your assets in dollar, and therefore let's have trade in national currencies. And eventually, the new development bank was significantly upgraded to become a development, as President Lula said at one point, the great Bank of the South, a credit lending institution which will give, and it will start lending already this year. I think they announced that they will lend the first credit in October in rupee and in other currencies. So it is a transformation, and it cannot be stopped. Now, the second question, I don't know. I think Lynn was a very, thorough methodological thinker, and he would not advise people to do things in a rush, which need to be done with care. And I think that's what I see what these leaders essentially are doing, because the difficulties to be surmounted are not small. I mean, you have to consider, they said that they will definitely create an international currency for balancing accounts among them, but to have a real international reserve currency with all that requires is taking a lot of consideration. You have to make it in such a way as a stable thing, so that it can last. Also, the other measures which are being mooted are all necessary. So I would say Linda LaRouche would for sure encourage them to move ahead full steam. But he also would say that the importance is that the principles which he laid out in many writings, the first one in the proposal for a new international development bank, the IDB, which he wrote in 1975, that is a document which is still absolutely actual and has the most advanced conceptions how such a new credit institution must be created. And then about 25 years ago, he wrote another document which is also extremely relevant to what is going on right now, and that is called Trade Without Currency, where he discusses the need to put such a new currency on stable mechanisms, such as not monetarist values like the IMF does with the special drawing rights, the SDRs, but to put it on the value of currencies and commodities, so that basically there is a parameter linked to the productivity of the respective economies and the labor force. And that is a completely different conception than you have it with the present monetarist considerations. So I think, since I know that the ideas of Lyndon LaRouche are circulating widely, I would be very optimistic that this will be done right.
Now, Helga, we have from the chat room a question that was, I think, initiated by your opening on the Indian space mission. Someone asked the question, how is the role of space going to shape geopolitics over the next 20 years?
Well, I think it is very important because it is the most important thing to shift the thinking of people about the nature of man. It's not just an exciting scientific and technological adventure to move into a completely new economic platform, because Lyndon LaRouche developed this notion of economic platform to mean that every time you develop a qualitative new method of economics, which space science lends itself to basically be continuously such a motor, it redefines all previously existing economic functions, and therefore it is really a jump every time you do that in terms of productivity. So it has extremely important scientific and economic features, but I think the most important is what it does to the identity of man. I always think about the vision of the great rocket scientists and basically astronomer and space scientist Kraft Ericke, who had this vision about the extraterrestrial imperative, basically meaning that, first of all, you have once you enter space exploration, it is a driver because it forces you to adjust all the previously assumed axioms to whatever is required in space, and that is a necessity. It does not allow for ludicrous, or space requires that you behave rational, and therefore it will change the identity of man from thinking of themselves just as earthlings who have the nose on the ground and don't look up to the stars, but to a species living in space. And as we have seen with the incredible cooperation among astronauts on the ISS, or in any other field, when they look down on the small planet Earth, tiny blue planet in a huge galaxy, and we are now living in one of at least 2 trillion galaxies. So the future of man in space will mean that we will think of ourselves as completely different, and it will change the identity of man. Imagine if you are having a village on the moon where all international countries are working together. Then you start from there to really seriously think about missions to Mars with revolutions in fuel technology such as fusion. You can reduce the time of travel significantly, so it will become safe for people eventually to travel to Mars. Then, maybe a couple of years down the road, but nevertheless, a city on Mars will happen. And then, beyond that, even, if you think about really several generations ahead, I'm sure that interstellar space is not interstellar travel is not something which is impossible to think of. So, I think that we are really on the beginning of a completely new era in mankind, because, rationality and the idea of cooperation, of scientific cooperation, that will be what I have called the age of adulthood of mankind, where we don't squabble around anymore and have little wars which are not to the benefit of anybody except the speculators. So I think this is really an extremely important day today.
We're listening to a very happy Helga Zepp-LaRouche, the founder and chairwoman of the Schiller Institute. We can take your questions at schillerinstitute.org or post them on the chat room. Now, Helga, I have a question again on the BRICS from someone who is retired from working with the UN Food Program. And this person wrote about Putin's promise yesterday that Russia would provide 25,000 to 50,000 tons of food to each of 6 African countries for free to address the food crisis. With Putin making that promise, with countries like Burkina Faso sending emergency supplies to Niger, doesn't that expose the hypocrisy of the rest of the world, which seems to accept that hunger and starvation are inevitable and that sanctions against hungry nations are acceptable?
I guess the answer to this question is yes, it does expose it, because, the Western media, again, had nothing better to do than to say, this shows you the evil intentions of the Russians trying to, make the poorest countries dependent on their grain. If you're sitting somewhere and you're about to starve, you will be absolutely happy about, anybody who comes to your life saving. And of the whole Russia-Ukraine grain deal, it has been found out that a lot of the grain which Ukraine could export did not go to the African countries or other countries in need, but it went basically into, Poland. It made the Polish farmers extremely upset because it was a competition in prices to the grain they produced. It went to other European countries. I think this is, I think the genie is out of the bottle, because, there was for a long time the effort to conceal all of these conditions. But I think the train has left the station, because, if you listen to the speeches of many, many leaders from the global south, they are now saying we have understood that, what the realities are, and they are not going to be discouraged. Even so, there is still a tremendous pressure, like on the ECOWAS in Nigeria, or situated in Nigeria, to go for military actions against Niger, or even on the AU, basically putting an ultimatum to the new government in Niger. So all of this reflects Western influence, but I think, I can only repeat myself, the more quickly the countries and forces in the countries, not just the governments, but the farmers, the trade unionists, the civil groups and others, the more quickly they express support for what is now evolving, the better, and the better are the chances that we will overcome the present strategic crisis in a very short time.
Now, I have a couple of questions that go back to the matter of geopolitics and the war danger. From a U.S. blogger wrote in the question that identifying that there was resistance to the opening of a NATO headquarters in Japan from Macron, and so that was at least somewhat postponed. And yet NATO seems to be going full steam ahead in Asia. You had the meeting last week of Japan Prime Minister Kishida, the president of South Korea, with Joe Biden, promising to move toward a coordination of what they described as an Asian NATO. And this blogger asks, why would Japan go along with this?
Well, that is a good question, which, many people should ask the Japanese, because it's for sure connecting Japan not with its best tradition of the Meiji Restoration. The Meiji Restoration would be the outlook Japan should have in joining what is developing with the BRICS right now. The Meiji Restoration was after Japan was self-isolated for several centuries. The people went out to the United States, to Germany, to Holland, and other European countries, and studied what became physical economy, and they brought it back to Japan. And within a few years, Japan developed and exploded from a, extremely backward country into one of the major industrial powers in the world. I mean, that literally occurred in less than a few decades. And, that is the outlook which was still existing in the post-war period with the Mitsubishi. I visited an interesting city, I forgot the name right now, not very far from Tokyo, a science city, where all the major Japanese industrial firms work together under one roof for the benefit of the whole country. And that Mitsubishi outlook, is what would be required right now for Japan to join with the BRICS. Unfortunately, as everybody knows, Japan has also another tradition, that of the military alliance, with Germany in the Second World War. And, naturally, this brings forward the most horrible memories in China, because especially the Japanese attacks on China and territorial conquering, including Hong Kong, many other battles, the massacre of Nanjing and all of these things. So this is really bad for Japan. And I don't know why Japan is doing that, because they have clearly to choose between two completely different traditions. And, one can only hope that the general dynamic convinces people in Japan that they have a better future than to join something which can only lead to a catastrophe if it is pursued to the end. And, given the fact that there are all these tensions already, there were several warnings that, even I think from one of the American think tanks, they said that a nuclear war in Northeast Asia in the next 10 years is likely to happen. Now, if I had such a perspective in front of me coming from a US think tank, I would start to think, hey, wait a second, the Americans are letting the Ukrainians fight in Ukraine. They would like to have the Nigerians fight in Africa against Niger. So maybe it's not such a good idea, and maybe we should really help to establish a system of peaceful coexistence of sovereign republics working together. And this whole idea of Asian NATO as being part of a global NATO is the worst idea and should be put into the mothballs, or better, into the waste paper basket. The more quickly, the better.
Now, someone who's been on some of the calls of the International Peace Coalition referred to your comments that the American Revolution was the first successful anti-colonial war, and that the Founding Fathers were explicitly against imperial policies. And this person asks, how can we get Americans to recognize that the development around the BRICS is in that tradition and therefore should be supported by real patriotic Americans?
I think that's one of the most important things to do right now for people in the United States, because unfortunately, the real history of the United States has really been forgotten or never learned by many, many people. But, we from the LaRouche movement, we did an enormous amount of historical studies. If you go on our websites, you find EIR, for example. We have an EIR archive. You can pull out an enormous amount of original historical research, because, the role of Benjamin Franklin in bringing the influence of Leibniz into what became the young America, the whole roots of the American system of economy, the ideas of a republic among republics by John Quincy Adams, and especially naturally the War of Independence against the British Empire for the right for economic development. I mean, that's exactly what the BRICS countries are trying to do now. And, it was President Sukarno at the Bandung conference in 1955, who in his major speech said that, he reminded the American people that they set the example and the pathway by fighting the first war against colonialism. And, I think that is exactly the viewpoint Americans should take right now if they judge what is happening in terms of the BRICS. Because, the reason why the BRICS countries have such an enormous attraction right now for, I would say, probably 130, 40, 50 countries. I mean, the only reason why countries say they are not supporting is because they're mostly under too much pressure to dare to do so. But, it is because they want to have the same right for development what the young American Republic was fighting for. And, they want to have the right to have, infrastructure as a precondition for industrial development. They want to have, modern energy, clean water, industrial parks. They want to have a decent living standard for all of their people, modern health system. And, that is really what the fight is all about. And therefore, I think to study the origins of America, to study the real history, the battle between the American system and the British system. Friedrich List wrote about that when he was in America for several years, and later basically you had Carey writing on the same topic. So, in a certain sense, the real history of America was to become independent to shed off the status as a colony and to have the right for development. And there were many phases because the British Empire did not give up lightly. They did not accept the loss of the, in their view, most important colony. So they started to try to undo this militarily in the War of 1812. Then, later with the Civil War, where the British Empire allied with the Confederacy to try to defeat Lincoln. They did not succeed. This was a major effort to try to undo the accomplishments of the American Revolution. And after that, they practically realized that it could not be done militarily. So they started, especially after the assassination of McKinley, to basically, try to influence the American establishment to adopt the model of the British Empire as the platform to rule the world on the basis of the Anglo-American unipolar world conception. And that's what we are still having to do with today. So I think the real, and it's very important to study that, and I can only suggest that people should really use our archives, because a lot of work went into that, including that of my late husband, Lyndon LaRouche, because, nowadays there are so many people in the world, and we meet them all the time, who are filled with a profound anti-American sentiment because they dislike the idea of an unipolar world. They dislike interventionist wars. They think what the US-led wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, for example, the Libyan war is a big issue of discussion in Africa right now. So they don't want this anymore. And therefore they throw the baby out with the bathwater by being anti-American. And that is not, that doesn't help you much, because if you don't talk to the United States to try to convince them and bring out the better tradition, I don't think we can solve the strategic conflict either. So it's not very wise to just, put a label on the United States and reject it altogether. I think it's important to cooperate, with good forces in America. And I heard with great pleasure that in the first day, more than 500 people were signing from the United States the appeal, which we mentioned in the beginning. And that is just in one day. We will definitely expand that. So I think that, it is very important. And, for example, what President Modi, Prime Minister Modi announced in terms of the BRICS Space Cooperation Consortium, that is exactly what John F. Kennedy had proposed to the Soviet Union. So, I think that idea will catch on in the United States, and there will be people who are, excited about space cooperation. And that will be one of the areas where you can build bridges and see that cooperation is so much more reasonable than, to continue on the war and continue on the path of confrontation. So I think that the history of the United States, what it really was and what it not was, should be an object of intellectual curiosity for everybody.
Well, and Helga, I'll conclude with an email I got from someone who just signed the appeal and said that she would be circulating it. She said she was inspired by it and by your optimism, so much so that she's willing to take on what seemed to be the dead former anti-war movement people in Europe to try and get them into the proper frame of mind to win this fight. So she thanked you for issuing the appeal, and she said, we've got to get more people behind this immediately in Europe. So any final comments, Helga?
Well, I want you to join my optimism, because people in Germany are generally so downtrodden and so pessimistic that nothing can be done. And indeed, if you only look at the inner German dynamics with this horrible government which we have right now, the chancellor just made a statement calling people who are fighting for peace fallen angels coming directly from hell. I mean, this is really bad. I think he has just earned himself a place in history for one of the most horrible, chancellors you could possibly think of. What a stupid statement to make. So if you only look at the German situation, you could get really depressed, but don't look at it that way. Look at it from above. Look at it from the dynamic of history. And, the majority of people right now, led by 5 very excellent leaders of their countries, are moving in the formation of a new world economic order. And that is something this movement, the LaRouche movement, has been fighting for I would say around half a century. And now it a lot of what my late husband, Lyndon LaRouche, wrote and we discussed and so forth and did a lot of incredible things over the decades. This is now becoming a reality. So this is a reason to be happy and get on board and get active. And I want to thank the person who just wrote this message. I'm perfectly happy to join your efforts because the peace movement needs to be put on that perspective.
Well, with that, Helga, thank you very much for joining us today, and we look forward to our discussion next week.
Yes, and become active right now. Sign the petition and call us, and let's do things together.